Good morning from New York and welcome to day 2 of the SDG 16 conference. My name is Maria-Francesca Spatolisano and I am the Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. I am very pleased to welcome the high-level speakers that are joining us from around the world. This session will be recorded and is live streamed on Facebook. And please note that interpretation in English, French, Spanish, and Italian is available. We will now begin today's first plenary session. The topic of the session is implications of the pandemic for the relationship between people and state. This is a multifaceted issue. It encompasses issues of trust between governments and their citizens, of responsiveness of governments to people's needs, of civic space and possibilities for participation and engagement, all of which are key aspects of the social contract between people and their governments. In the UN 75 anniversary declaration, global leaders highlighted rebuilding people's confidence in government as a major challenge. We will talk about trust in public institutions, how the pandemic has affected it, and how it can be sustained in the future. We will address policies that ensure equitable distribution of public goods and delivery of services, particularly to those most at risk of being left behind. As discussed yesterday, the pandemic has affected key government functions and processes and has sometimes undermined the effectiveness of government action at the national and subnational levels. In this session, we would like to hear about how the pandemic has affected the way public institutions interact with people, and how we can rebuild trust, including by reshaping public participation and communication. We would like to hear about measures that open space for participation and stakeholder engagement, among others. To address these issues, we have a stellar panel of speakers. Each speaker has up to 10 minutes for their interventions. And it is my great honor to introduce the first speaker, Ms. Michelle Bachelet, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Ms. Bachelet, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Assistant Secretary General Maria-Francesca Spatolisano, distinguished panelists, excellencies, colleagues, and friends. The need to transform governance has been among the major lessons of the COVID-19 pandemic in every region of the world. So our discussion today is of urgent relevance for policymakers around the world, be it in terms of civil, political, economic, and social human rights, public health, economic and social resilience, sustainable development, a healthy environment, or conflict prevention. The pandemic has shown how high levels of discrimination, injustice, and inequality have harmed not only those individuals directly targeted, but also everyone else. They have undermined our resilience to shocks and public trust in institutions. It has also demonstrated how people's access to information and capacity to participate in decisions and their trust in science, the authorities, and institutions of society make for better outcomes. This is not only in terms of compliance with medical advice and lockdown restrictions, but also much more broadly in the context of social cohesion. As the Secretary General's progress report on the SDGs points out, this could lead to and I will quote, an increase in social unrest and violence, end of quote, that would also greatly undermine our ability to meet the targets of SDG 16. We can see now, far more clearly than we did even just 18 months ago, exactly why it is essential that states accelerate efforts to advance institutions and policies that are inclusive and just. The way in which our governance systems provide justice for all, especially those furthest behind, will be crucial to getting through this crisis and ensuring more peaceful, sustainable, and resilient societies in the future. SDG 16 captures well this interlocking relationship between justice, peace, public trust, inclusive institutions, and sustainable development. Justice, including social justice, is vital to enduring peace, and it rests on accountable governance, a vibrant civil society, and impartial, independent rule of law. Countries where people trust their institutions consistently show higher levels of political participation, according to research. And certainly, inclusive institutions are vital to democracy and to building forward better. Secretary General Guterres has consistently called for a new social contract that should create equal opportunities for all and respect human rights and freedoms of all. As he points out, this respect for people's human rights is essential to advancing development. It is, and I will quote, the only way that we will meet the goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement, and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, agreements that address precisely the failures that are being exposed and exploited by the pandemic. End of quote. The pandemic is an unbearable human tragedy, but in highlighting the urgent need for greater respect for people's rights and their trust in government, it can also be a powerful catalyst for work to build societies that are more fair, more equal, and therefore more sustainable. How can human rights guide the renewal of public trust? I suggest that firstly, universal social protection should be institutionalized and made permanent. Over the past 15 months, many governments have adopted new measures that strengthen or set up key social protections in line with the universal human rights to social security. There is no longer any doubt about their power to reduce economic, social, and political exclusion and their profound benefit across communities and social classes. These innovative and powerful recent measures include introducing new cash transfer for informal workers, people working in the gig economy and others often excluded from the social protection system, easing eligibility requirements to widen coverage and include undocumented migrants among others, increasing the amount and duration of benefits to ensure that beneficiaries can afford basic goods and services in the context of the current crisis. They need to be institutionalized for the longer term to avoid the sudden shocks that harm individuals, economies, and societies, eroding public trust in political systems, justice institutions, and the social contract, and leading to grievances and potential conflict. States should aim at putting in place universal and comprehensive social protection in which everyone is protected. Secondly, action must be taken to eradicate discrimination of any kind. Leaving no one behind is not an empty slogan. It is an action plan. The discrimination that holds back millions of people on the basis of their racial, ethnic, linguistic, or supposed caste origin, their sex, their disability status, or for any other perceived reason is deeply unjust, illegal, and damaging to everyone. Discrimination against women and girls damages their equal enjoyment of human rights, hampers their participation, and results in lower levels of trust among women. Cultivating public confidence in government decision-making and development that improves life for all requires the key human rights principle of non-discrimination and equality to be effectively upheld. Only by ensuring inclusion of all voices can trust be restored.
Glad to have you.
My third point, the right to participation is crucial to building trust. Experience demonstrates that responsive, accountable, participatory, and inclusive institutions at all levels will build more peaceful and just societies, and that they will steer development that is more sustainable because it's deep, broad, and self-regenerating. When people can freely seek out information and shape decision-making by voicing their needs and views, policy will be better adapted to the live realities on the ground. Better policies achieve remorseless, respectful processes, strengthen the public trust. Similarly, positive feedback loops are created when governance is not only participatory, but also transparent and accountable. Concrete action to increase people's participation in decisions should include recognizing the value of civic space and the legitimacy of critical voices, promoting dialogue and engagement with the widest possible range of voices, and protecting and supporting human rights defenders, including women, as well as journalists, trade unionists, and activists for social justice. Fourthly, tackling corruption should be viewed as a human rights goal. SDG 16.5 commits member states to substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all forms. The theft of or misuse of what should be public goods and public funds is a profound abuse of trust. It violates the core human rights principles of transparency, accountability, non-discrimination in every aspect of society. It exacerbates inequality, weakens governance, undermines the provision of services and the rule of law, impedes investments, and erodes public trust. Secretary General Tørres has termed it criminal, immoral, and the ultimate betrayal of public trust, a long-standing source of distrust and anger against their leaders and governments. The UN Convention Against Corruption is the principal legal framework for combating corruption worldwide, and it is complementary to international human rights law. The first ever session, a special session of the General Assembly on Corruption to be held in June this year, will be an opportunity for a landmark commitment that centers anti-corruption efforts on human rights. Yes, fighting corruption may require sweeping reforms that clash with deeply rooted special interests. It requires an effort of political will, but it is an investment that can pay massive economic, social, and political dividends. Excellencies, human rights provide a framework to understand the roots of people's distrust in governance and take effective action to correct those causes. This is why the 2030 Agenda so explicitly recognizes human rights, because they are levers that will ensure truly broad-based and sustainable development. Effective, accountable, transparent, and participatory institutions are necessary building blocks. Without them, any economic growth risks leaving huge numbers of people behind, exposing societies to sudden and drastic shocks. As our countries continue to combat COVID-19 and ultimately recover from the damage it has caused, I trust that all of us will act on these clear lessons of our experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Bachelet, for your insightful remarks. As Ms. Bachelet has pointed out, effective, inclusive, and responsive public institutions that promote engagement and civic space are key for renewing the social contract to build trust between people and state. We are eager to hear countries' experiences and governance strategies to build people's trust during the pandemic and beyond. And I would like to invite His Excellency Hector Leonel Ayala, Minister of Governance and Decentralization of Honduras, to share the experience of Honduras in this regard. Mr. Ayala, you have the floor.
Muchísimas gracias, distinguida señora Michelle Bachelet.
Thank you very much. Dear Ms. Michelle Bachelet, High Commissioner for Human Rights and former President of Chile, Mr. Casas-Zamora, Secretary General, Mr. Chungong, Deputy Director General of UNESCO, Ms. Liv Tørres, Director of Pathfinders, Ms. Maria-Francesca Spatolisano, our moderator, Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs from UNODC. I would like to thank you very much for the kind invitation you have extended to me. And I would like to greet all the authorities represented here, ladies and gentlemen. With respect to the SDGs and the quest for peace, justice, and the creation of sound and effective institutions, our country as well has tried to reinforce our institutions based on two fundamental pillars: democratic fight and the protection of the rule of law. And right in this time, where the pandemic is hitting the world, our country is fighting very hard, and it managed to bring about some positive consequences for our people in terms of their relationship with the government. So people and the government has established a very close alliance that amidst this crisis has helped us reinforce our social fabric. We reinforced the judicial power, the executive power, and the power of our government through automation. And we worked hard to digitize several procedures and processes, for example, judicial proceedings as well. And this is a direct outcome of the pandemic and how it forced us to change. Another innovative aspect was having virtual hearings under the auspices of the Justice Board. So plenary sessions were held virtually, and appropriate and suitable laws were passed in order to reinforce several aspects related to citizenship. And this was done through laws and through decrees of the executive power, allowing us to keep growing and keep developing despite all the difficulties we have encountered so far. On the 19th of February last year, we have declared a state of emergency when we recorded our first COVID case. And after declaring the state of emergency, we have looked for other ways to help our citizens, to guarantee sustainable development. Therefore, we are promoting economic growth through electronic platforms that are currently being used by the civil service. We have also offered tax credits for small entrepreneurs and citizens that had problems with their credit lines with banks. So thanks to state investments, citizens could exercise these options to promote their economic development despite the difficulties. There have been some gradual restrictions, for example, social distancing and the like. We recorded 200,000 cases and 5,200 deaths, sadly. But the death rate was pretty low compared with other countries that unfortunately have paid a higher price in terms of deaths. We also set up a new secretariat for the executive power to promote government actions and to offer better coordination. And this is a great solution to restore trust in institutions. It was important to protect the health of our children, so classes classroom-based lessons were suspended, and we introduced sanitary and sanification measures, and all these were part of the executive decrees that were passed. And then a couple of points that I consider to be important. A decree was passed to offer support to the agri-food sector. and credit to the sector was increased by 8.7%. And government support was also granted to the construction sector, a 5% rate. With a number of tax credits for the purchase of tangible assets. Our secretariat has adopted a number of measures, and decentralization was one of them. So we were pretty innovative in this regard, and through local authorities, we have granted local transfers, and the central budget allocated funds to local authorities. We started a program called Solidarity in Honduras. And during the lockdown phase, we also helped people that were living in remote areas by bringing them food and drinks. So we met their needs with an unprecedented speed in the history of our country. And then we launched another program called Go Honduras. And through decentralization, we have sent resources to local authorities to build healthcare centers and to create inpatient and outpatient clinics, and also to pay healthcare professionals, because it was important to have the support of HCPs also in remote areas where medical assistance was needed. Our secretariat also took care of justice to pursue the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have activated this new department to meet the needs of our people, to guarantee access to justice, also at a local level. And there's a second point I would like to raise here. So conflict resolution, well, thanks to the support of the Chilean government, and thanks to Ms. Bachelet, we cooperated with mediation centers so that our people could provide information to our citizens. And the lockdown, as you know, has witnessed an increase in domestic violence cases. In many cases, we have managed to cooperate with a 90% response, thanks to the help of these centers. Then automation, as I said, we automated a number of processes and procedures for civil justice cases that were still pending in Honduras. So this had some very positive consequences and very positive impact on our people and on our citizens, especially in the relationship between our citizens and our government, by granting access to justice for everyone. Effective, responsible, and inclusive institutions have created peace, have guaranteed transparency and accountability. It was a great pleasure to share with you my experience and my feedback from Honduras. We managed to rise up to this great challenge, and we understood that we are all vulnerable, but we are all inhabitants of this planet. And we must share hopes, and we must help each other. And we must guarantee respect always. It was a privilege for me to be here with you before such distinguished panelists, and I hope my feedback was useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency, for your remarks. we are very grateful to you for having shared the experience of Honduras. And it is well known that the pandemic has abruptly disrupted the regular functioning of public institutions, and this includes parliaments. To address this issue, I am pleased to introduce Mr. Martin Chungong, the Secretary General of the Inter-Parliamentary Union. Mr. Chungong, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Assistant Secretary General. It gives me pleasure to be on this panel today with my distinguished colleagues, and I wish to thank the organizers for inviting me to share some of the thoughts that we have, much of it based on the experience that we have witnessed during this past 1 and almost half year of pandemic, which is unprecedented. I welcome this opportunity to reflect on Goal 16, because what we have witnessed during this past year has shown that Goal 16 has all its relevance, and it is one of those goals that has been challenged deeply by the pandemic. It has, as we have seen, the pandemic has threatened or has actually rolled back a lot of progress that has been made in the implementation of the SDGs. And as previous speakers have said, and I quote my colleague Michelle, there has been an exacerbation of inequalities in society. You know, the gap between the haves and the have-nots has widened, and many people are being left behind, especially the vulnerable groups in society. But I think that when we are talking about negative impact of COVID and what we do post-COVID, we need to address that issue that is on the table, the elephant in the room, the lack of trust in public institutions. And I am glad that we are focusing on that today. And when I speak on this issue, I always want to remind myself of why there is so much mistrust in public institutions, especially by the citizens. And I always say it is good, for good reason, that citizens do not really trust the public institution, because we all know that public institutions are not delivering as the citizens expect. It may not be their fault that they're not delivering, but much of the time, I think they have the blame for not being able to deliver to the people. So whatever we need to do to restore public trust in institutions is to look at how public institutions are delivering on the expectations of the people. And I look at the parliaments as a starting point. We also know that public institutions in many countries, including parliaments, are not as inclusive as they should be. We have, in recent months and only a couple of days ago, we have also published a report which shows that half of the world's population is made up of people under 30 years. But when you look at the composition of parliament, only 2.6% of parliamentary membership worldwide is made up of young people in that age group. How would you expect outcomes to be legitimate and inclusive if Parliament is not reflecting such a huge chunk of public society, the public? The same thing with gender. We know that on just slightly a quarter of the world's MPs are women. They should be at the table. So we need to address the issue of inclusiveness. Inclusiveness in terms of representation, but also inclusiveness in terms of how the issues of society, their concerns, are articulated into relevant policies. This is a big challenge when we address the issue of trust. So I put that on the table. And of course, when we talk about inclusiveness, we're talking about empowering women, young people, vulnerable groups, making sure that they have a meaningful input into public policies. I would like to echo what Michelle said about the need to fight corruption. This is, if there's something that undermines public trust in institutions, is corruption, because these institutions generally are seen to be self-serving and corrupt themselves. And so we need to fix this issue. And I think the solutions are out there. We just need the political will to make sure that the issue is fixed. And then I want to put on the table the issue of institutions being seen as oppressors of the people rather than the protectors of the people. Many of the human rights abuses that Michelle denounces every day, that the IPO denounces every day, are caused by public institutions. And so we need to transform the narrative. We need to make sure that the perception that public institutions are violators is changed, that they should be playing the role of protecting human beings. So if we look at this, then we can propose those solutions that are out there. First of all, to promote transparency. One of the lessons we have learned during the pandemic is that there is fear in society. People are afraid because of misinformation. At once there's access to so much information that it's difficult to sift through this information and find out what is real and what is not real. And I think that it is important that we promote greater transparency, that we make more information available to the people to understand what is going on and to allay their fears. I have talked about the need for inclusiveness. It is important to have inclusive policies and inclusive institutions. And let me just go to the role of parliaments. And our experience since the beginning of the pandemic has shown that, yes, there has been some shift in the balance of powers from the legislative to the executive arms of government by virtue of the emergency legislation and policies that have been put in place. But I would like to say that parliaments have not been sleeping. They have proved that they can be resilient institutions. I think the minister from Honduras made that point. Parliaments have continued to function, albeit differently, albeit under restrictive conditions. And so what we need to do here is for parliaments to reclaim the initiative, for parliaments to rebalance power, to make sure that government and its policies are under closer scrutiny by the parliament, according to the constitutional arrangements that are made in every country in the world. So parliaments need to reclaim that leadership. Especially in a period of prolonged restrictions and lockdowns on freedoms of the people. These were supposed to be emergency and temporary measures, but we have to make sure, Parliament have to make sure that they don't become permanent measures, because those laws were made for extraordinary circumstances. So I would like to put that on the table. As I said, the issue of information is also very important, and Parliament, as the representative of the people, needs to be closer to the people to inform them, give them the right information on what is going on. Look at the whole controversy over the vaccine, people being worried about the effects of some of those vaccines. I think parliamentarians, because they are the people's representatives, should take on that role to explain this clearly on the basis of information that they get from their government in the context of oversight, because according to the Constitution, parliaments are entitled to get information from the government on what is going on. So that information should be conveyed to the people in a very timely fashion. And I think that the parliament should be tuned to the people all the time to listen to those concerns and articulate them, take them to the parliament, to the government for action. I realize that my time is running out, and so I would like to take up some of these points when we come back to the interactive discussions. But I will say, to conclude, that what we need now is to build systems that are resilient, systems that will be better able to respond to the shocks that we have experienced over this past 1.5 years. And this calls for stronger institutions, institutions that are more responsive, that are addressing the real needs of the people, putting in place adequate resources, because this is very important. Also, the resources, the policies may be there, but if you don't have the resources, then they are a dead letter. So, and I want to put on the table then that Parliament should be playing a more robust role in this regard in managing the current pandemic, but also helping to put in place a framework that will enable the global society to cope better with the pandemic. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Mr. Chungong, for your insightful overview of the Parliament's role in responding to the pandemic. The pandemic not only is changing the way we lead our lives, but may also and has affected civic space and democratic processes at the local and national level. In this regard, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Kevin Casas-Zamora, the Secretary General of International IDEA, that is the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Mr. Casas-Zamora, over to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Assistant Secretary General, and thank you to the organizers for this very kind invitation. I'm honored to share the panel with so many distinguished speakers and to be part of this global discussion on Sustainable Development Goal 16 on peace, justice, and institutions. It is a discussion that International IDEA has been involved in for several years now. IDEA has played a leading role in the SDG 16 data initiative launched in July of 2016 by a consortium of 17 partner organizations to respond to the dearth of comprehensive data on SDG 16 issues and to make possible an open and holistic tracking of the commitments made by all 193 UN member states. We are proud of the work that we've done and convinced of the instrumental importance of SDG 16 for all the other goals. Indeed, the subject matter of this panel falls squarely into the discussion of how to reshape our institutions to bring about more inclusive societies, fairer economic structures, and more democratic political systems than those that have been revealed by the pandemic. I will make 4 points about the relationship between citizens and the state. My first point is that the pandemic is showing that in many countries, the social contract needs to be revisited. This pandemic has revealed in stark tones the social, economic, and political fault lines that were pulling many societies apart well before the virus struck. In country after country, it has become evident that the plague preys on the most vulnerable groups, afflicted by lack of access to adequate healthcare, overcrowding, and myriad underlying conditions that expose them to the ravages of the disease. While the middle and upper classes easier can adopt their work and lifestyle to a life in lockdown, the majority of the world can't. For the hundreds of millions of people in the developing world who live off the informal economy, selling their wares on the streets, teleworking is not an option and quarantine is an unaffordable luxury. This pandemic multiplies poverty and inequality with the same ease and for the same reasons that it feeds off them. The virus is not man-made, but the patterns of its dissemination and of its consequences most certainly are. In many countries, the fault line and inequalities revealed by the pandemic are simply not compatible with a healthy and stable democracy, which is what I care about. If they are to stave off the dangers of populism and authoritarianism, many democracies will have to return to the drawing board and renegotiate the social contract, the distribution of burdens between social groups, and the relationship between societies, states, and markets. And the sooner, the better. My second point is precisely about the need to place the issue of state capacities at the heart of our policy debates. Both the management of the virus and the vaccination process have demonstrated beyond any doubt the importance of having a robust state with adequate capacities. I once heard someone say that when the most fanatic of libertarians is in a shipwreck, he will feel a deep sense of elation upon seeing a government's Coast Guard appear on the horizon. Something like this has happened to us collectively. In both the developed and developing world, there is a greater recognition of the dire price that societies pay for under-providing public goods, particularly healthcare. The sight last year of a conservative politician like British Prime Minister Boris Johnson heaping praise on the National Health Service and calling it Britain's greatest national asset suggests that a long overdue rebalancing in the relationship between states and markets may already be in the making. If we're going to build back better after this calamity, we must focus on the capacity of democratic institutions to respond effectively to the needs and demands of citizens, particularly when faced with major crises. We can and we should activate multilateral mechanisms to increase the learning and the exchange of good practices to improve the abilities of democracies to deliver. We need to tease out and disseminate good practices for efficacious institutional design, good practices to craft fiscal pacts to sustain fiscal robustness and fiscal responsibility, good practices to improve the quality of public administration, and good practices to strengthen citizens' trust in institutions, which is one of the key lessons that we've learned over the past year. Successful countries have institutions that are endowed with social trust. To strengthen trust in institutions, we must help countries up their game to deal with the pandemic of corruption, which is eating away the legitimacy of political systems everywhere. It's been mentioned here. If we don't do that, trust will never be built. But we must be aware that this is a very steep hill to climb. The data from International IDEA's own Global State of Democracy report shows that remarkably, the proportion of countries in the world that have high levels of corruption has not changed one bit since 1975. Despite the prominence of the issue, despite the myriad national and international efforts and the billions of dollars that have been thrown into trying to solve the problem, the world is flatlining at best when it comes to corruption. It is flatlining because, as our data also shows, it's also visibly failing to make progress on judicial independence, which is the key when it comes to dealing with corruption and impunity from it. And there might be worse to come, because we also know that freedom of the press and freedom of expression and civic activism, all of which are essential to unveil corruption, are under assault all over the world. We need to build back the state better and cleaner. There are few political assignments more important than this one. My third point is that the greater the role for the state as a result of the pandemic does not come without warnings. This kind of role carries the risk of the state encroaching in multiple ways into the sphere of citizens' freedoms. This is a risk that has been abundantly borne out by events over the past year, and we must be vigilant about it. Emergency powers have always been part of the arsenal of democratic governance, although they are rarely used. Now, the vast majority of democratic governance in the world have invoked them, many of them in a prolonged and questionable way. In a report published by IDEA last December, we stated that over 40% of the world's democracies have adopted emergency measures to combat COVID-19 that violate democratic principles because they are disproportionate, illegal, indefinite in time, or unnecessary to confront the disease. This includes numerous cases of countries that have used those measures to beat down the independent press and civil society organizations. I have the impression that the inclination to invoke Emergency powers in the face of any serious challenge will be with us for as long as the eye can see. And this is a particularly problematic prospect in light of the climate crisis. The disruption created by climate change may end up being a big threat for democracy and human rights. And let me add that all of this is a risk, not simply because authoritarian leaders may be hell-bent on expanding their powers, but because fearful citizens may tolerate it. The real risk, in other words, is that societies grow used to some of the restrictions and encroachments that we've seen over the past year, that we all become numb in the face of a more intrusive state. My fourth and last point is about how we build new social contracts. Countries will need to activate the institutions able to process the wide-ranging social and political dialogue called for to heal the wounds revealed by the pandemic, as well as those left by it. In most places, parliaments and political parties will not be able to do the heavy lifting required. More will be needed. The social and economic councils that in different versions exist in 22 out of the 27 members of the European Union offer, by way of example, a promising venue for such a broad-based dialogue. Unfortunately, such institutions are not found in many places outside of Europe. In other places, constitutional assemblies may offer an opportunity. This is the case of Chile, the country of High Commissioner Bachelet, where the massive anti-inequality demonstrations of late 2019 led to the decision to start a process of constitutional redrafting. One could only hope that the sheer magnitude of this crisis will result in many new constitutional settlements, new fiscal pacts, and new social covenants of the kind that frequently emerges in post-conflict and post-authoritarian contexts. The alternative to this kind of process is continued toxic levels of inequality, political instability, rising authoritarianism, and violence. In other words, the alternative is darkness. It is incumbent on all of us that work to advance democracy to do everything within our reach, from speaking up to nudging, accompanying, and facilitating knowledge, to help countries go down the route of dialogue towards a better social, economic, and political equilibrium. There are very few silver linings in this catastrophe. The opportunity to rethink the relationship between citizens and institutions, and thus renew the promise of democracy, is one such silver lining. We should grab it with both hands. Thank you.
I thank you, Mr. Casas-Zamora, for sharing information on how democratic rights have been affected during the pandemic and how to address it. Now, the focus of many governments on the response to the immediate needs and challenges posed by the pandemic has diverted attention from long-term capacity development efforts. I would like to invite Mr. Xing Chu, Deputy Director General of UNESCO, to share the organization's perspective. Mr. Xing Chu, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Assistant Secretary General. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me to take part in today's panel on building trust between people and state, and more specifically on the impact of the pandemic on this trust relationship, which lies at the very core of SDG 16 to promote just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed and exacerbated the challenge of erosion of trust in our societies. It has been accompanied by a spread of disinformation, conspiracy theories, and hateful content, which risk further undermining trust and dividing societies. At a time when solidarity and social cohesion are more needed than ever. Opacity and lack of access to information not only complicate the response to the crisis, they also risk of fostering distrust and suspicion. This has affected trust in public institutions, but also trust among citizens, trust in the media, and ultimately trust in each other. At the same time, the global crisis provides us with an opportunity to reflect on how to build and maintain trust as part of our global efforts to build back better in a post-COVID-19 era. And in view of ongoing and future crises, including the longer-term impact of the current health crisis, possible future pandemics, climate change, and challenge of persistent inequalities. In responding to these challenges, and as we have embarked on the decade of action to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, UNESCO remains committed to upholding public goods that are essential to build and maintain trust. This includes education, science, and culture, which form the foundations of our societies. In relation to SDG 16, this also entails upholding information as a public good, which is central to building trust, including trust in public institutions. When citizens are informed and exercise their right to information, they are empowered to hold institutions accountable, which helps consolidate the trust relationship between people and the state. We have witnessed this in the context of the COVID-19, when it comes to the dissemination of reliable information about the health and about the measures taken by governments in response to the crisis, for instance. In that regard, SDG 16, and in particular, SDG Target 1610 provides an important framework for us to promote information as a public good, with its two indicators on ensuring public's access to information and protecting fundamental freedoms. The right to information plays a crucial role in supporting accountability systems, especially in times of crisis, when governments and public institutions have to make critical decisions with impact in terms of health, socio-economic life, and human rights. Public access to information also empowers citizens to participate in collective initiatives at the intersection of SDG targets 1610 and 16.7. For example, it enables citizens to actively contribute to efforts to stop the spread of disinformation surrounding the pandemic, which in turn contributes to limiting the spread of the COVID-19. As the custodian agency for the monitoring of SDG indicator 16.10.2 on public access to information, UNESCO advocates for access to information laws as a means to build trust between people and the state. According to our data, there has been a major surge in access to information laws worldwide, from 39 such laws in the year 2000 to 127 in 2021. Building on this trend, we continue to provide the policy advice to establish and enhance access to information legislation in accordance with international standards and to support their implementation. Our organization also provides technical advice on how governments can build public trust by displaying leadership through proactive information disclosure. In times of emergency, governments and public institutions need to go beyond posting information on a website and ensure that key information effectively reaches all citizens. This can require the use of ICTs and social media platforms so as to reach diverse audiences. It may also require the disclosure of information in a range of local languages, including indigenous languages. In that regard, UNESCO also assists governments to strengthen their transparency and increase proactive disclosure and open data in line with access to information laws and policies. Ensuring public access to information also means enabling citizens to navigate a rapidly evolving and increasingly complex information landscape. This is the objective of UNESCO's program on media and information literacy, which empowers citizens, and in particular youth, to adopt a critical mindset as to information they are exposed to. As such tool to address the challenges of disinformation and hateful content, and thereby helps bridge distrust and divides in our societies. This in turn can also help build trust vis-a-vis official sources of information, including public institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, the right to information should also be considered as a corollary of the right to freedom of expression. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought about new challenges to this fundamental freedom. It is enshrined as part of SDG Indicator 16.10.1. The economic impact of the public health crisis has taken a toll on media outlets' economic models, threatening their viability and survival. Journalists have been detained and prosecuted for exposing the failings in authorities' handling of the health crisis. And emergency legislations and measures adopted to curtail the spread of the virus in many countries have served as an alibi to restrict freedom and of expression. In the face of this, UNESCO urges governments to protect the journalists and safeguard fundamental freedoms, and advocates that free and professional journalism is an important ally in the fight against the disinformation and pandemic. In the lead up to 3rd May, we are celebrating the 2021 edition of the World Press Freedom Day, coinciding with the 30th anniversary of the Windhoek Declaration, which called for free, independent, and pluralistic press for the development of our societies. This year's celebration, taking place in Namibia and also virtually as we speak, focus on the theme of information as a public good and explores what can be done in the production, distribution, and reception of content to strengthen journalism and to advance transparency and empowerment while leaving no one behind. Creating an enabling environment for the sharing of information through free and diverse media is essential, as it underpins democracy and reinforces action to fight against corruption. As such, freedom of expression serves as a central pillar for the building of the trust between people and the state. The World Press Freedom Conference will address several of the challenges mentioned earlier by identifying steps to ensure the economic viability of news media, by defining mechanisms to ensure greater transparency of internet companies including to address disinformation and by promoting media and information literacy. In doing so, it will attempt to illustrate how promoting information as a public good is necessary to build back better in the post-COVID world. As the United Nations specialized agency spearheading the implementation of the UN Plan of Action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity, UNESCO remains fully committed to fostering a freer and safer environment for media workers worldwide. This is all the more crucial as our data shows that over 1,200 journalists have been killed between 2006 and 2020, with close to 9 out of 10 of these killings remaining judicially unresolved. Impunity for such crimes sends a chilling message across societies and perpetuates a cycle of violence against media workers, which deprives citizens of their right to information and jeopardize trust relationships in societies as a whole. Through our action in this field, UNESCO contributes to the achievement of SDG 16 and its indicator on fundamental freedoms by monitoring and reporting on the killings of journalists, and by training members of the judiciary on international and regional standards on freedom of expression and the safety of journalists. In this sense, a direct link is also drawn between SDG targets 1610 and 16.3 on the rule of law, as judges and members of the judiciary can play an essential role in ensuring a safer environment for media workers, who in turn guarantee greater transparency and accountability in governmental institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, these examples of our action, I'll conclude very in 1 minute. Yeah, these examples of our actions show that promoting the free flow of information underpinned by public access to information and freedom of expression is critical to building and maintaining trust between people and state. But the importance of protecting information as a public good goes beyond the scope of SDGs target 1610. Information serves as a key enabler of the realization of all sustainable development goals, and it is increasingly important in strengthening health, addressing divides, including gender inequality, and building efficient and accountable institutions in all fields. I would like to conclude by underlining these cross-cutting linkages between information, trust, and the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. It is only through the mobilization of all actors of society and through the development of strong trust relationships between them that we can realize the aspirations set out in the 2030 agenda while leaving no one behind. I thank you. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Mr. Xing. I hate to cut short such an interesting presentation and a fundamental statement about the value of access to information, freedom of expression, and other human rights from UNESCO, very important vantage point. But we're running a little bit late already, so I appeal to the following speakers to self-contain. We will now have the pleasure to indeed to listen to Ms. Tørres, the director of the Pathfinders. Ms. Tørres, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. And I'm very glad to be part of this distinguished panel. Very glad also that you have put this very timely subject of trust social contracts and governance on the agenda. I think all the speakers before me and Betsy coming after me will all agree that we are living in demanding times and we have little time to act. There's an urgency now that we need to have with us as we go forward. I'm very happy that Michelle Bachelet started with the need to focus on a human rights basis and pillars. People want rights and they want the realization of their rights. And I'd like to start my intervention with a quote to Eleanor Roosevelt that I often revisit. Eleanor Roosevelt asked, "Where after all do human rights begin?" And she answered, "In small places close to home, so close and small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere." So why am I starting there? And why do I regularly revisit this quote? Because it is a reminder to me and many others that we need to focus on deliverables at the local level. We need to assure that rights are realized, and they are realized where people live, work, and communicate with other people in their neighborhoods, at their workplace, in their homes. Now, I'm saying that with the knowledge that more than 5 billion people have unmet justice needs, and more than 1.5 billion people have had problems with the justice systems and not had their own problems and rights issues constructively taken forward by the justice system. They have been failed by the justice system, and these figures, as some of you will know, are from the task force report, the Justice for All report, and reflecting realities from before the pandemic. Now, we know that we were off track before the pandemic. We know we were off track on trust, on the goals of achieving the SDG 16 plus before the pandemic. We were off targets when it comes to inequality and the distribution of resources. And then the pandemic hit us at the beginning of last year and increased our challenges and problems. We said in the beginning that we were all in the same boat. That was not the case. We were not in the same boat, and we are not in the same boat. Reality is that some people are traveling on large yachts and others are forced to swim behind to shore in dark and cold water. Inequality has grown, increased with the pandemic. We know that those that were most vulnerable already have been hit hardest. We know that inequality has grown. We know that the justice gap has grown, the gender gap has grown, domestic violence at home has also increased, etc., etc. We are in major problems, and there's an urgency in addressing all of this. Now, what have we learned from this crisis and from previous crises? We have seen again that those most vulnerable are hit the hardest. We have also seen, I think, from previous crises, and I think we will see this again now, that top-down approaches will not work very well. We need to address this with the focus and the goal of addressing people's justice needs, economic needs, and rights at the local level. What can we do in order to improve people's lives in their neighborhood, at their homes, at their workplaces, etc., and assuring that people have access to those rights that we started off with. We've also seen before, or learned from previous crises, that stimulus packages need to be remaining for a relatively long period in order to help people and reduce the gap that we've been talking about. We have also seen from previous crises, and should learn from that the low trust in institutions and the growing anger coming with that lasts for a very, very long time. We are now facing a triple crisis, a health crisis, a socioeconomic crisis, and on top of that, also a political crisis in many places. And the need to now focus on a renewed social contract around the world in many countries is urgent in order to increase trust and lower the simmering anger. So what do those social contracts need to include? Well, they need to address inequality. They need to reduce the gap. The social contracts need to address the justice system and transform the justice systems in order to assure justice for all. They need to improve delivery and assure that people actually have social security, get access to social security, and have livelihoods and hopes for the future. They need to assure transparency. They need to assure that we build alliances and coalitions. The social contracts and social dialogues that have previously and now shown to have the best effects are those that are participatory, listen to people, but also invite organized representative organizations and actors into the table. And the social contracts need to assure, first and foremost, and reflect a wish to act, that what we are now focusing on are not just theoretical concepts, but they are actually a willingness to act, and that we see the urgency in the situation. There's been many before me that have talked about not leaving anyone behind. That is a clear goal that we are striving for, but I think history has also shown us that we will not achieve that goal unless we address the SDG 16+, peace, justice, and inclusion goals. They are the pillars that we need to build our strategies on in order to assure that we leave no one behind. And with those words, thank you very much, Maria-Francesca.
Thank you, Liv. You have been to the point, and I appreciate your use of time. Thank you, Ms. Tørres, for reminding us indeed that understanding the connection between COVID-19 and inequality is key to an effective and inclusive institutional response, and the need to act now. Now, restrictions of movement and assembly around the world have altered working methods and processes of institutions, including courts, potentially affecting access to justice. I would like now to invite Ms. Elizabeth Andersen, the Executive Director of the World Justice Project, to share the perspective of an independent organization that works to stimulate action to advance the rule of law. Ms. Andersen, over to you.
Thank you very much. And it's certainly an honor to join this distinguished panel. And I thank IDLO and UNODC for convening us for this really important discussion about this global crisis in trust that we are confronting. As others have observed, this trust crisis flows from a global crisis in governance. For the 5th year in a row, the 2020 World Justice Project Rule of Law Index saw scores decline in more countries than improved, with a negative slide in particular in scores measuring constraints on government powers, corruption, and fundamental rights. And as Liv has mentioned, we are also seeing dramatic statistics in our data collection around the failure of our justice systems to meet people's everyday legal needs. WJP has surveyed people in 101 countries about their everyday justice problems around employment, housing, debt, family issues, access to social services. And we found these problems to be ubiquitous. More than 50% of citizens surveyed in 101 countries had had these problems in the last 2 years. And the vast majority did not turn to the formal justice system or legal advisors to help them with these problems. More than half reported that their problems were ongoing, and 43% reported these legal problems had negative consequences for their health and their well-being. Mr. Chungong summarized this data very concisely in his assessment that our institutions are just not delivering. And that is the unfortunate picture that we see. The data is symptomatic of broad and systemic governance failures, and it is therefore no wonder that people do not trust institutions. While, as others have noted, the pandemic has set this entire agenda further back, we also can begin to see in this global crisis and the varied responses to it, some ideas about solutions for the future. We have seen the difference that specific choices in favor of justice, inclusion, and accountability make. And we can begin to identify strategies, as we are this morning, that strategies that can make for more resilient societies and that we can prioritize in the coming months and years to rebuild trust. In the brief time we have remaining today, I just want to focus on 2 such strategies. The first is tapping the power of data and evidence to design more responsive and cost-effective programs to meet people's needs. And second, harnessing the cutting-edge technology that can help us meet those needs. First, regarding the value of data and the importance of evidence-based strategies for advancing Goal 16. This is very much the work of the SDG 16 Data Initiative that Kevin has highlighted, and we're pleased to participate in as well. Data, using data to inform, stimulate, and measure progress is, of course, at the heart of the SDG agenda. The World Bank's recently published World Development Report also underscores the transformative nature of data in development. Yet, in our Goal 16 community, we are data poor. We are far behind other fields in gathering and using data and evidence to drive our agenda forward. The health sector has benefited from 30+ years of data on risk factors for health and randomized control trials to pinpoint the most effective interventions. The data and evidence that they have has led to measurable progress on public health. There is nothing comparable in the justice and governance sector. To the contrary, our sector is plagued by disinformation and the politicization of narratives about justice that undermines trust. Data and evidence are a powerful antidote to these challenges. If we can begin to gather and use people-centered data, data that helps us understand justice in the small places, close to home. Thank you, Liv, for reminding us of that powerful quote. If we can have that kind of data informing our efforts, we can better understand how people experience governance, where the gaps are, and how to plug them. At a time when budgets are strained, we need evidence-based approaches to train our scarce resources where they can have the greatest impact. Data can also show us important differences in the way that people experience governance, that we are not all in the same boat. The pandemic has highlighted these differences, but without disaggregated data that reveals the particular experience of poor, minority, and marginalized populations, we cannot devise strategies that truly leave no one behind. Over the past year, the World Justice Project has worked together with the Open Society Justice Initiative and Pathfinders to map the justice data ecosystem. We wanted to know what data was being collected, by whom, how was it being used, what were the gaps, and what were some of the models that could be replicated. We've recently published a paper together with Pathfinders on grasping the justice gap. It has the results of that study and our recommendations for our community to use data more effectively going forward, and I commend it to you. The second set of strategies that I'd like to highlight for advancing Goal 16 and rebuilding trust rests on tapping the potential technological innovation to strengthen governance, responsiveness, and accountability. The World Justice Project is just now completing a 6-month exercise, our World Justice Challenge, in which we invited change makers across the globe to share with us their best strategies for responding to the rule of law challenges that we are confronting in the pandemic. And I want to thank again International IDEA and Pathfinders and IDLO for their partnership in that World Justice Challenge effort. If you are looking for hope in these dark times, let me invite you to the World Justice Challenge website. We received 426 applications from 114 countries, reflecting the resilience and creativity from a wide range of actors, government and intergovernmental organizations, the private sector, academic institutions, and NGOs. The 30 finalists that are displayed on our website, they represent an impressive array of strategies and approaches, but there's one thread that runs through many of these very effective responses, and that is the transformative effect of technology. Organizations and communities that are able to harness technology are proving more resilient and effective in the face of the pandemic. Consider, for example, My Voice, an initiative of the Foundation for Public Participation in Latvia. This is a virtual platform created to provide citizens and civil society the opportunity to suggest policy and legislation to government. During COVID-19, these public submissions led to valuable trust-building initiatives to support families with education initiatives and consumer credit holidays. Or we can look to Colombia, where the Ministry of Justice used a web-based tool, its legal app, to help citizens who were struggling to access social services and justice in these difficult times. The tool provides free consultation with step-by-step instructions about how to access legal support and to solve conflict. The ministry's website saw a 20% uptick in visits over the last year, with 6 million people tapping into this resource. We heard from Minister Ayala similar initiatives in Honduras to use automated approaches to delivering justice. We can also look to the jurisdictions with robust digital identity and digital financial infrastructure who've been able to deliver much needed assistance to businesses and people in this time of need. If we didn't know it before the pandemic, we do now, that digital identity is a key strategy for addressing the needs of the 1 billion people globally who lack proof of legal identity. This is a rights violation that has cascading effect in deprivation and injustices in these people's lives, and technology has the keys to a solution. In these and many other examples, Technology is providing opportunities to reach and serve more people, to bring transparency and accountability to governance, and to foster greater trust between people and institutions. It's not without challenges. It is not a cure-all. It brings many risks. It threatens rights. Technology can threaten rights, even as it promises their vindication. Moreover, the digital divide is wide and real and needs to be addressed. But we cannot shrink from these challenges, nor can we slow the pace of technology. We must find ways to mitigate these risks while harnessing the very significant upside that these advances provide. To sum up, the pandemic, as my colleagues have highlighted, has brought renewed urgency to our Goal 16 agenda. And to the many good ideas that my colleagues have shared this morning, I add just two: harness the power of people-centered data and evidence to ground our conversations in reality and help us understand people's justice needs and serve them. And second, embrace technological innovation that can be a game changer in advancing justice, accountability, and inclusion at scale. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Ms. Andersen, for your insights on the power of accurate data collection and analysis, and of course of technology. Now we will begin the open discussion, and we have received many questions. I have selected three. One is, around the world, people have found it hard to access accurate information in languages and formats they could understand, which is much needed, of course, in order to protect themselves, their communities, including against the virus. And also the spread of misinformation became a pandemic of its own. What can be done to address this? The second question is about intolerance, and how can this be reversed? And the third one is to address how to address intersectionality issues post-pandemic and in the future. Now, our panelists have been with us and have shared their views. I would like now to invite each one of you to address these questions or things other panelists have said, and conclude with one or two recommendations on enhancing trust in public institutions and public governance. If you have to really focus on one or two things, what would you recommend? And I would like you to do all this in 1 minute each, which is very difficult, I realize, but we are running out of time, unfortunately. So let me go in the same order as our initial panelist speaking order. And first of all, I would like, therefore, to invite Ms. Michelle Bachelet. Please.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to say, first of all, it has a great pleasure for me to be in this panel. And I think all the presentations have been fantastic, and they're really going in the same direction, I think. So I would say, using Martin, my dear friend Martin's words that I have used in the past a lot, institution has to deliver. And has to deliver, on one hand, on the needs today during the response to the crisis, and afterwards to the recovery of the crisis, in terms of ensuring social protection system, economic and social justice and rights are ensured. The second thing, and also here, and I will take Elizabeth's last point in terms of data. Yes, data, for the reason she said, that she was focusing more on justice, but one of the things that's essential, and we all have spoken about that the virus does not discriminate, but impact disproportionately people. And I think if we don't have the segregated data to identify those people, they're going to be left behind. Because if a woman is an old woman living with disability, if she comes from an indigenous region, or rural or poor, is different when she's a rich woman, etc., etc. And I think the majority of states do not have the segregated data to be able to develop the responses that really need to leave no one behind. And I mean, now the pandemic has amplified all what we knew in the past of inequalities, but this, if we don't solve this in terms of data, it won't be there. The other thing I would say in a group and a global way, for the people, but with the people, not talking about the people, it's with the people. That's why participation is so important and particularly the most marginalized, so they are really included in the solutions in terms of their needs. And I think that we have to recognize also here the value of the civic space to promote dialogue, invest in safe and equal participation channel. And third, and I finish here, to find pathways to allow people to advocate for the protection and fulfillment of human rights. But all of this, I have to say, I agree completely with what all my other colleagues have mentioned, talking about the ground, the territory, the local, but we also need governments and institutions to give examples and to be coherent, to say what they're going to really do, to promise what they're really going to achieve, and good and frequent information in an adequate language for the normal and simple people, language of the street as well. Because I think many of these things is not happening. It's much more complex, and I think all my colleagues have raised many important issues. Thank you.
I thank you, Commissioner. And now I would like to invite His Excellency Hector Leonel Ayala. Excellency, you have the floor.
Sí, nosotros compartimos la necesidad de la transparencia.
We share the need to keep elaborating on transparency, keep focusing on the access to justice, accountability, and reinforce the institutions. The reform of institutions is essential in this regard, so a structural transformation to create a new institutional dynamics, which should serve the purpose of transparency. We must build a more just society. We must understand what's the role of social justice, what's the role of development. And this can happen only through the participation of citizens. And only through them and with them, we will be able to contribute to human rights, to the exercise of human rights, and to the rule of law. Another fundamental contribution regards the reinforcement of the ability of society to respond through governance, through the availability of mechanisms that set the stage for such reaction, for such response. We have chosen decentralization as a solution, and this gave excellent results. And then alternative dispute settlement mechanisms and other solutions to allow for a better participation of our citizens. This will contribute to greater transparency of accounts, greater transparency in the management of information, and this will further reinforce the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. And now
Grazie,
I invite
Eccellenza.
Mr. Chungong.
Adesso Martin Chungong.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I am very heartened to see that a lot of emphasis is being laid on information, because misinformation has the potential to be very, very disruptive. And so it is important as a way forward to make sure that information, the right information, the accurate information is available. So one of my colleagues mentioned the fact that Goal 16 is data poor. And I think that it is important that we begin to gather information on good practice that goes out there. When I made my statement, I said that one of the lessons we have learned is that the COVID pandemic has been driven by fear, and fear has been fueled by misinformation. So it's important to re-inform the society. And this is a responsibility not only for the government, but also for Parliament, that is with the people, but the media. The media should be educated on the need to spread the right information, and because we are dealing with a matter of life and death, and that is important. Another point I want to make is that of building more legitimacy for governing institutions. And we need to look at how those institutions are constituted. Primarily when it comes to parliament or government, it's through elections. We need to pay more emphasis to the organization of elections under conditions that would guarantee accurate outcomes that are reflective of the will of the people. This will enhance the legitimacy of these institutions. We have seen that in some countries, governments have used the pandemic as a pretext for not organizing elections. But we have seen others, and it's good practice, that have insisted on organizing the elections subject to the putting in place of protective measures. So we think that the pandemic should not be an excuse to delay or to postpone democracy. On the contrary, it is an opportunity to strengthen the pillars of democracy and uphold the values that are embodied in democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This makes a good transition, and I give the floor now to Mr. Kevin Casas-Zamora. Please be mindful of the time, which is really now very short. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will focus my last remarks on the question of corruption, because I really think, I mean, there are many ways to go about the issue of trying to rebuild trust in institutions, but I think if we are not serious about corruption, trust will never be built. And there are many things that, there are many fronts in which this war will be fought. The first one is judicial independence. That's the fulcrum in the fight against corruption. Nobody can claim to be serious about fighting corruption if it's not serious about protecting judicial independence. The regulation of money in politics, which has become a huge problem globally, and unless we are serious about that, we're not going to be able to deal with one of the key sources of corruption globally. Number three, we need to propel forward e-government, which of course has been massively stimulated by the increased digitalization that we've seen in everything over the past year. E-government makes governments more effective, make institutions more cost-effective, more transparent, and it changes in the fundamental way the interaction, precisely the issue that some of us here. I mean, it changes dramatically the interaction between citizens and institutions in a way that the interaction of the citizen with state institutions does not become a nightmare and a negation of their fundamental rights. So e-government is crucial. Protecting freedom of the press and civic activism, which are essential to unveil corruption. And finally, as Elizabeth was saying, we need data. And we need data for the specific purpose of generating early warning systems that can detect the deterioration in terms of freedom of the press, in terms of civic activism, in terms of judicial independence, so that we generate the forces to counter the deterioration of those key institutions. And this is one of the things that we are trying to do with one of our projects, the Global Monitor in COVID-19 and Democracy and Human Rights, which we have developed with the help of the European Union. It covers 162 countries. It is updated constantly, and it detects those measures adopted to fight COVID-19 that have concerning effects on democracy and human rights. I encourage you to check it out. This is the kind of early warning system that we need to develop further. Thank you.
I thank you, and I invite Mr. Xing to take the floor. 1 minute. Thank you.
Thank you. Responding to these three questions raised, I would like to highlight again that the right to freedom of expression and access to information are crucial elements of the civic space and essential for the transparency and accountable governance. They are key to fostering trust between citizens and governments, but also among citizens, thereby building social cohesion. SDG target 1610 is central in this regard, and it intersects directly with many other SDGs, whether it relates to reduction inequalities, SDG 10, ensuring equal opportunities for all, including in terms of gender equality, SDG 5, or on health, SDG 3, and overall for the realization of all 17 SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Director General of UNESCO, and give the floor to Ms. Liv Tørres.
Thank you very much. I think we are all underlining the same need for information, better information, and fighting misinformation. I think Elizabeth also highlighted very well the need for better data as an early warning system, as Kevin highlighted it, but also to monitor progress and developments. We need better data and information, and that is a challenge to all of us individually and the institutions we represent. The same goes for the fight against intolerance, and I do think we also need to keep in mind, all of us, that there's a lot of good things to say about technology and social media, but it has also done something about our dialogue and our debates. I'm not talking about this one, but in general. Sometimes when we look at the web, it looks more like echo chambers and angry people shouting at each other. And to pull in and take up dialogue again and listening to each other, help get the constructive dialogues going forward is important, I think, in order to fight both intolerance and discrimination and radicalization. We need dialogue, actually, as well as human rights, more in the encounters with people that we disagree with, and maybe people that have views that we don't like, then when it comes to the people that we have closely around us in our own circles. So to pull up dialogue again and test our muscles in dialogues and proper debates as a pillar for democracy building, I think is important to fight intolerance also. What is needed for trust? Transparency and fighting corruption is definitely one of them. A willingness to listen to others, invite various constituencies and representative groups into the table of governments in order to hear their priorities and see how we can build something together, I think is important. Others have also highlighted the value and benefits that social dialogue processes have contributed to around the world and through history. And I think this is the crucial time to sit down around the table and actually have proper negotiations about where to go from here. Coalitions, I think we need to recognize, and this is my last point, Maria-Francesca, we need to recognize also that while we are here talking about peace, justice, inclusion, and governance, the SDG 16 plus is under heavy pressure globally. So the more leaders and countries that can step up and say that these are actually the pillars that we need to rebuild on, will be important. I'm very happy about the Pathfinder coalition with the 38 UN member states and a lot of other partners represented, for example, in this panel, having shown and showing daily that leadership, but more leaders need to step up to say that peace, justice, and inclusion, as well as good governance with social dialogue, etc., is crucial in order to assure that we leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Liv, and give the floor to Elizabeth Andersen, 1 minute.
I'll be very quick. I know we're over, and I really want to just underscore what many of my colleagues have said, and particularly about this question of information flows, and highlight the importance of that information flow to be two-way, that information flows out to citizens, but also that governments listen to citizens, and that we take a people-centered approach to governance and to our Goal 16 agenda. We need to listen to citizens, whether it's through data, through civil society, the media. I want to underscore the benefits of protest in this moment when we have massive movements afoot across the globe. I want to invoke my friend, the late Christoph Haynes, and his really important work on peaceful assembly. And to paraphrase him, protest is not something to be feared or quashed. It is actually the sign of healthy democracy. It is a mechanism for often the most marginalized in society to make their voices heard. And it should be an opportunity that we embrace to renegotiate social contracts. And so with that, I will yield the floor, and thank you again for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you, all the panelists. Really, I appreciate you taking the time to be with us today and your incredible insights. And this justifies the fact we took over the break time, and there will be basically no break for the starting of the following session. But I am told I am allowed to give you 3 minutes, and we will start the next session, plenary session 2.2, at 15:50 rather than 15:45. So thank you again for being with us and sharing your real interesting views. Thank you, and have a good day wherever you are. We'll start session 2.2 in 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you.